first place. So we can just have John report back to us to see what he has for feedback after this letter goes out. If there seems to be a lot of people that didn't get the original message, then we can maybe consider a workshop at that time, but hopefully we won't need to do that. I think we've processed this thing pretty well.
Okay.
And as President Andrews, there's plenty of time because like I said, the first application isn't scheduled till probably around August. So at the earliest, so there's plenty of time to send out a letter and if need be, have a follow-up.
Okay, so I seconded his motion.
Aye.
But
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Is approved. We get so. Follow that up, please. We have the money in place, okay. Okay, our next item, aquatic plant survey along lake, pond 1. Okay, John, tell us about this, please.
Mr. President, managers, you might recall that Link Laddie, the president of the Lake Olson to Montville Lake Association, asked the managers if they could provide some assistance to him. He's been managing the invasive aquatic plant species in Lake Montville and Lake Olson. And there are these, and I guess the Long Lake Lake Association has also been managing the aquatic plants in Long Lake. But there are these 3 ponds in between Long Lake and Lake Montville that he believes are contributing to the problems in Lake Montville and Olson. So he's requested that the Valley Branch Watershed District conducts surveys, aquatic plant surveys of these 3 basins. Meg Raddy of our office contacted the subcontractor who's been doing the point intercept surveys of the plants for Valley Branch Watershed District over the last several years, and he estimated the cost to be under $2,000 to do the point intercept surveys for these sites. And so included in the memo is the scope and the breakdown of his costs. The Watershed District does have a reserve fund under the monitoring budget item that would cover the cost of this if the managers choose to pursue.
Okay, so this seems simple enough. So do the managers have anything they'd like to add or say regarding this? Go ahead.
you know, we obviously saw this coming because you talked to us about this before. I think it's fine doing this survey. But the challenge will be is what if we find one little sprig of curly leaf or something in one of those basins, right? So then are they gonna go ahead and do a massive plant treatment or whatever? So I don't think that changes my support of what we have before us. It's just something to think about.
Okay,
Just my mind always dwells a little bit on the hysterics that one little aquatic invasive species can cause. That's all I'm saying. So
I think this is excellent plan in terms of approaching it this way because we're doing it holistic. We're looking at holistic systems and treating the whole system instead of treating parts and having them not work well together. So I think that's really a valuable way to go. I think it can be much more effective with our management of invasive species.
very good. And then one more piece on that. Mr. Broward, did you have a chance to look at it recently? Pond 1?
Not since the previous meeting where I'd gone out there, but there's certainly access where they can get in, into the water. I'm not sure how they get into that middle, is right off the freeway there, but the Long Lake South and the Pond 1 seem like those are pretty doable.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir.
Link Laddie has communicated with Meg, and Meg has then communicated with the contractor. The easy access would be coming in off of Viking Drive, which is kind of the south frontage road of Highway 36, and then you can access both Long Lake Middle and Long Lake South. And the surveyor would be using a kayak, so he could easily climb up the embankment for Gateway Trail and climb back down the embankments to do the platform.
Kayak, not a John boat?
Right.
All right, if no one has anything else, I'd like to make a motion to direct BAR to work with the ARS Subcontractor completed July aquatic plant survey at Long Lake, Middle, Long Lake South, and Pond One upstream of Lake Montreville and downstream of Long Lake, and to expense the ERS monitoring work to the basin, stream, and groundwater monitoring reserve budget item.
Second.
So moved and seconded. Aye.
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 Okay, that is approved. Thank you, sir. Okay, our next item is Valley Branch Landlocked Basin Flood Mitigation Comprehensive Planning Study.
Mr. President, managers, I think Alex with us tonight to review some of the work that has happened since the report with Valley Branch Watershed District and the Army Corps of Engineers prepared at the end of 2023. And the goal of the discussion is to really get some input from the managers and determine what actions the managers would like to take for dwellings that have been identified at risk of flooding.
Okay. Jen, before you begin, thank you. That was pretty comprehensive. So I assume all the managers, including myself, have had a nice look at this to see what we're gonna prioritize, if that. So, thank you. Go ahead.
Well, President, managers, thanks for having me. I have a little presentation pulled together. I'm gonna just spend a few minutes recapping sort of what the takeaway was from the landlocked basin study and then talk about, the prioritization that we've done since then. And so, at a high level, the goal of the study really was to understand, could we manage high water conditions, on these landlocked basins by pumping, or would acquisition be a different alternative? And so we went through the study process, and really the main takeaway was that, the cost to manage and pump and, discharge and mitigate kind of peaks and make sure your flood control system has capacity was expensive. And then there was some uncertainty tied to the PFAS issue in the area of whether or not you would have to treat it, or whether or not you'd be even allowed to move water between these basins. So ultimately, the direction that we took at the end of 2023 with the conclusion of the study was that voluntary acquisition of at-risk properties was a more cost-effective approach. We had identified several steps in 2024. There were three different kind of major items that we were going to move forward with. One was about prioritizing acquisitions and just looking at, could we manage water differently at some of these individual dwellings. Another was tied to reviewing stormwater management and quantifying retention needed in these landlocked areas. We're not going to talk about that tonight. And then developing policies and communication plans around emergency pumping. So I think really, the takeaway is when we did the study, we did sort of a planning level assessment of impacted structures. So we used guidance from FEMA that directs, whether or not under flooding conditions, if a structure may be potentially damaged or impacted, and compared it with the not only the surface water modeling, but also considering sort of the results of the groundwater modeling and trying to understand, what is the shape of the groundwater surface? Could there be groundwater impacts on some of these lower homes adjacent to these basins during high water conditions? I think the big takeaway here is that during that study, we did work with the Army Corps to access homes where we were given permission to survey low floors and low openings. So for some of the properties that we've prioritized and looked at, we have fairly accurate numbers on those. For the others, we had to estimate what a low opening and low floor might be from LiDAR and the best available information. So there is just that's something important to keep in mind, because there's a lot more uncertainty for those properties where we're using estimated numbers. And at just a high level, we had estimated that if we had acquired all, potentially impacted dwellings, the acquisition cost could be up to about $17 million. And that was using Washington County tax values, and then a factor of 1.35, which was similar to what you guys have recently done with a lot of the study work. So what we wanted to do was say, is it realistic to think that, from this planning level study, that you would acquire 45 homes just outright, or let's take a little time to look at it? And so what we wanted to do was say, kind of more individually look at each one of these homes, look at all the information we have available for it and what we know about the property. And what we wanted to do is try to prioritize which are the highest priority down to the lowest priority of these potentially impacted homes. So what we did was we took all the residences that were in the original study, and then there were a few additional homes that didn't get flagged during the study, but we wanted to just review them again because they were homes that maybe historically John or others had conversations or heard concerns from residents about high water conditions. So we included those in the list and went through this prioritization process just to make sure we didn't miss those. And so what we did was we went through and said, well, high priority are going to be homes that could be directly impacted via a low opening, meaning these are homes that are likely located on the landlocked basin. And given the flood elevation for the basin, that elevation is above the surveyed or estimated low opening. So those are homes that are most critical. Then what we did was we looked at the list and said, okay, which of these homes were flagged as potentially impacted, where the peak water level we were looking at, relative to the home was above the low floor. So in this case, it's not likely a walkout that's located on the basin, but it might be a home with a more traditional basement located on the basin or nearby to the basin. So maybe not directly on the basin, but across the street. And said, well, if we're seeing a situation where the peak water level is above the low floor, we call that medium priority, because there's the potential that during these high water conditions, groundwater could be seeping into the basin. And then low priority were homes where the estimated peak water level was below that low floor. And again, there were some homes that were flagged in that range because of the way FEMA defined potential damages and impacts to homes. So they say, a home, if there's water within 2 feet of the low floor, there could be damages. And so during the planning level study, we used that as an initial threshold to define these.
So one quick question, are you aware of whether those homes are relatively new or they've been in place for a while?
We do have information on that. We didn't factor that into the prioritization. And that is one of the things that, we'll kind of bring up in terms of engagement with landowners, especially those that are, from estimated homes where we don't have surveyed information. There's this question about, well, do these homes have sump pumps or not? That could help in some of these cases.
Right.
And make it less of an issue. But we don't have that information right now. And there's not a database through the county or anything like that that tracks sump pumps. That's more of just, it's on the residential homeowners. If it's a newer home, it's more likely that they have it than an older home, but we have no information. So graphically, I would say, the high priority just visually are, what you're seeing here is that in these cases, a water level on the basin is above the low opening. For the medium priority, you can see that blue line just representing either, the high groundwater or high basin water level. You can see it's above that low floor.
Do you want to go back? It's the pond's not small, so.
The Clawwater Pond, that's
So, for example, the 100-foot elevations is the dash line, and the low entry is here. So water can get into the house through the low entry. Saying here, the low entry is here, water can get through the. Whereas the medium priority on the next screen, this is where there isn't any open. It's but the 100-foot elevation is multiple floor, so there could be this problem.
And then finally, the low priority is that blue line representing the peak water elevation. You can see it's dashed and below the low floor. So it could be within 2 feet, but if a house has a sump pump, and this is during a wet condition. So during dry conditions, it may not, it's not really an issue. Given how much swing we saw in the groundwater levels for many of these basins during that wet period of time. So we had gone through and essentially took that list of, it was approximately, I think, 49 homes, and we tried to prioritize based on all the information, looking at and all the different model results, what we knew historically, the best information we had available to us. Even revisiting some in Street View, trying to understand, okay, you know, some of them we determined after looking at some data, for example, around Legion Pond from SEH, from some work they did for the sanitary sewer. We were like, well, some of these are actually split levels. So what we had originally assumed was the depth of the basement was actually a little bit shallower because it's a split level and not a full basement. So we went through and did our best to sort of refine this more individually. And what you can see here is that, you know, by basin as well as just total, you can see for high priority homes, so these are homes with that direct impact. These are the most critical and most prone to flooding. You can see out of the 49 we looked at, there were 10 of them that were flagged as high priority. And the estimated acquisition cost using, you know, the similar methodology, but we also brought dollars up to today. So we added about 20% to this. It's about $4 to $6 million for acquisition. And I think the one thing to note is one of these homes on Clawwitter is the home that you are already taking care of.
Right.
So that cost is not in that total. Yeah. Any questions about the high priority numbers? Okay. So then medium priority, those are the homes where during wet conditions, we would expect that it's possible that they would experience high groundwater, potential groundwater damages around the home, you know, due to that, again, because that groundwater level may be above the basement floor. You're talking about 13 homes there. You can see the distribution around the different ponds. Legion Pond is the most problematic pond of all the water, you know, basins that we looked at. And then low priority, you can see more than half of them were flagged as low priority. So those were homes where the peak elevation is within 2 feet likely of the low floor, but you know, again, if they have a sump pump, it may not be an issue, or it may not be, you know, an issue without a sump pump. I mean, it's sort of at a screening level,
Right.
they seem like the last place that, you know, effort should be focused.
That sump pump is working overtime. Legion Pond, we haven't heard anything from them lately. But I remember that one episode. And we're okay there, right?
We are.
Okay.
Yeah, and then this just comes back to my statement about, you know, surveyed versus estimated floor elevations. And making decisions based using ideally, you know, the surveyed elevation of a lot of these homes. So what you can see is, you know, of the dwellings, the 49 dwellings that we had looked at through this sort of refinement process, you can see over half of them are based on estimates and not based on survey. And again, that was an artifact of just not getting response or not getting authorization to survey those homes. So I think, you know, the big ask of you as managers tonight is really tied to, you know, based on the ranking of these homes, kind of what is the overarching action that you could envision Valley Branch taking, moving this forward, you know, as it relates to these potentially at-risk structures, and what role do you see the watershed playing? And so what we've tried to break it down is, you know, for high priority, these homes do meet. Yeah, these homes do meet your acquisition policy. And so really for an action, you could really consider voluntary acquisition for those homes. For the medium priority where it's groundwater impacted, you know, it leaves a question for you of, do you want to be involved in managing groundwater at residential properties? So we've laid out some options, and there's an or with all of these, you know, there's kind of different levels of how much you do. One is you could consider voluntary acquisition, especially if we believe some of them meet the intents and goals of the policy. One of the things we had started looking into as part of the planning level study, but again, without individual details of homes, you could begin investigating wet flood proofing. Another option would be to educate residents just about sumps, waterproofing, direct them to information that's available through other agencies and things like that, or you could take no action. And then for the low priority homes where it's, unlikely they're impacted, or it would be a really extreme wet condition that they may see something, you could look at education or taking no action. And before we get maybe to the discussion, there's just a couple of considerations that we just wanted to throw out. So for the high and medium priority basins, I did sit down with some of our hydrogeologists and we talked about what are realistically, like what could we be doing to manage water differently if we aren't managing water at the basin scale? Is there a really clear answer for these homes at an individual scale? So one of the things that we've thought about, for some of the medium priority or even the high priority water bodies where they're impacted by a very small amount of water, this is the berm at Legion Pond. Is it perfectly designed? Maybe not right now, but it does separate some of those homes from the lake. And during dry conditions, when groundwater levels are low, it may serve its purpose. But in a scenario in a landlocked basin where groundwater levels come up, this doesn't necessarily protect the home. So it's not necessarily, it could be considered for some of these homes, but in these landlocked settings, it's maybe not the ideal solution for protection of homes.
And one other point, it's not just that the groundwater level could come up, it could be up there for weeks, months, years. Right. So it's a little bit different than maybe what Secretary Brock is more familiar with is Red River Valley flood. This is some points.
Also, one other point, if it's relevant, we're not aware if Legion Pond communicates with Lake Elmo. So in other words, we have some sort of aquifer or a spring, so to speak.
You do have a model now that you could look really specifically and closely at looking at what movement between the two water bodies looks like. It is a model.
Yeah.
And there's always the saying about models, but and it depends on, the level of detail, the information that was able to be brought into the model.
Yeah.
But you do have a tool now where you could spend a little more time looking at that as well. And, they answer questions if you have specific questions about that. The other consideration, I think, maybe before we get back to the discussion is just, with regards to wet flood proofing, and that's really, when we talk about this for more of the medium priority water bodies. Again, I was sitting down with the hydrogeologist and being like, is there, a lot of these homes probably already have sump pumps. And in general, they might be helping out during high groundwater conditions as long as they're working, they're appropriately sized for the volume of water that could be coming at these homes. It's not a solution long-term if you're going to have, high groundwater conditions for a long time. It's not a recommended approach. Yes, you want your sump pump, but if your power goes out, you have a home that is still at risk. And in a landlocked system, unlike more of a riverine system or a lake with an outlet and the water levels come up and then they go down, you just are really recycling water. So that's where, when you look at guidance from, for example, the Army Corps, when you look at, this is kind of hard to read, but the real takeaway is that, when you look at, this is sort of a matrix of flood risk management. When you have homes with basements that have long-term flooding, really, they're talking about relocation, acquisition, doing some fill and elevating, or doing wet flood proofing. So wet flood proofing is a situation in which you allow water to come into the basement, you elevate utilities, you could potentially even be filling an entire basement. But it changes what that basement is for a home, which is a big deal for some of these homes. So that's just a consideration. And again, it comes back to the question of, do you believe the role of the watershed is to manage groundwater at a residential scale? So coming back to that, I guess, we want to open maybe the floor to your thoughts around what actions could be taken for these different priority rankings. And then we can talk about maybe some more detailed next steps, depending on the conversation.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
President Sean, I just have one, maybe a comment on the communication strategy on this. We're always talking about acquisition, voluntary acquisition, but you know, the flood proofing option, even in some of those high priorities, doing some, you know, elevating the structure, that sort of thing might be an option. So I just want to be careful so people don't think the only option, we're going to bulldoze all these houses and take them off the tax rolls and, you know, all this, and that's not necessarily the case. So just a comment on our communication on this to maybe make that a little more prominent.
I think that that's a great point, especially with Legion Pond properties. Now that they're connected, they got connected to city sewer last year. Whereas other houses that still might have a low septic system and there's not enough room to place a mound system to prevent that from flooding, like almost all the properties that Sanford Lake. Now there might be opportunity to raise some of these houses because even though they have a small lot, they're connected to sewer.
And also the sump on those would empty into the sewer system, right? No? Oh,
My council doesn't allow
And there's no stormwater system to pump.
that. That was some of the major options that Jen looked at.
And, you know, when we did the emergency pumping at Legion, you know, we did pump it north and then west towards Lake Alamo, and that was because of the emergency condition. I think the feedback that was gotten,
oh,
it wasn't, when we looked at the alternatives, we looked at, it can't go to Lake Alamo, just based on, yeah. So we had to pump south, and there was a lot of piping, a lot of lift station, a lot of mitigation to keep the project in 2007 system at.
so we did do that initially when we had the pump and the line put in right down 30th Street, I believe.
Yeah.
And then we stopped that, and that was just for emergency pumping. I think that lasted a month or something.
So that, I think that's a future step that we'd like to discuss with the managers on. If that situation would come up again, do the managers want to do the pumping? Or do they want to say, no, now it's time to purchase your house if it fits your policy?
Okay,
So, but
so,
that, I think that's a separate discussion because that's
Right.
pretty complicated. But tonight, hopefully we can get your input on, do these priority levels make sense? To have high priority, medium priority, and lower priority? And then if they do make sense, do we have authorization and direction to do some few next steps, like meet with the city of Lake Alamo?
right,
Try to close the gaps on any information that we don't have, like try to survey these low homes, and I guess that's.
Yeah, so we can come back to the conversation about
So-
actions, but, you know, if you were for the high and medium properties, especially those that are still being based on
Yeah.
estimates, I think it's worth reaching out to those homeowners yet and seeing if they'd be willing to get their, you know, low floor, low opening surveyed. We can also ask them questions similar to the questionnaire we originally sent out, but we could also ask them about sump pumps and like, do they already have a sump pump? You know, did they have any water issues in the 2019 or 2020, you know, things like that. And I think that'll refine that list a little bit more.
yeah. So this to me seems a workshop issue that we can certainly delve into deeper. But I see this at this point, high priority is something from, you know, from past experience that we've already taken care of. And so we would consider certain ones. And without a doubt, because of the continuing themes within what we've been doing this year, the last couple of years, education has to happen. So I think to let the managers know that that's something that I think is a good idea, regardless. Everybody needs to be aware, and this is going to permeate everything else we're doing because this is coming up again. But the high priority, we can have a discussion on this and that reflects on our policy. And also the priority or the seriousness of the particular property that we might have to purchase or at least consider the option. Talk to somebody, but we can avoid hassles if we bring that up in a more immediate way that we can say, well, this is what we're anticipating. So that's where the education component comes in. And I don't know how they feel, to scare them. I'm certainly scared because of the cost and the hassles involved. And also whether we're sticking our necks out and making this financial commitment into something that we may not have done in the past. So do we want to do this? Or what can we do? Can we ask the county to help us or other agencies to spend the money? Municipalities like Lake Elmo, we're certainly not going to put this on somebody else. But we need to understand, just like with treatment of invasive species, aquatic invasive species, that we're not just going to go, well, we'll take care of that for you. That we need to determine how we're going to go about it. So far, with that one, Mr. Labby has helped us tremendously, or helped his community and the lake that he lives on. So,
Mr. President,
President Marchand, I just, I'm just trying to put myself in a homeowner's shoes.
Yeah.
Thinking about this, and I would hate to ever get into a situation where they read a newspaper article about a meeting with Lake Elmo where my house was being discussed and I didn't even know.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if at this time would be a good time for us to contact these people that are high priority and just say, we've done this study. It appears your home meets our criteria for high priority, and we'd like to work with you to evaluate this more and
Yeah.
explain the options, blah, 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 and something like that, but at least have some initial communication with these high priority
Yeah.
people, at least make that offer to them where they see their address
yeah,
in the
yeah.
newspaper or something.
If I didn't explain that, I think that's exactly what we need to do, because everybody needs to be aware of what is happening and what we can or can't do. But also, when we make them aware, if they're amenable to discussion, then we can get further information about their situation. Like you said, do they have a sump? What do they have? What can they do to mitigate anything that might happen? So that's another issue.
I like the notion of the high, medium, low priority. I think that's real workable. Talking about education, I think there may be some things to do, and the one that I thought about in terms of making it a little less abstract for people in terms of, oh, this is, 932 is the elevation, and I don't know how many people really relate to what that elevation is, but thinking about Legion Pond, especially if there were an actual one or two shallow observation wells that would allow everybody in the neighborhood to see, here's what the water levels are, the groundwater levels are, and we'll survey your basement and put a measuring stick in there so you can see this is where the water levels are in relationship to that observation well. That gives them some real concrete type of information about what the conditions are. Then the next piece of that, I'm sure there's other things like that that can make it more real for people. Go beyond that, and look at, well, clearly doing, some mitigation is much more cost effective than having to purchase homes. And, I would imagine that more people would be, open to the notion of looking at, okay, here's some mitigation procedures you can do on the medium priority homes. I suspect that there are people in the high priority homes that no, I'm not gonna move. I don't really care what happens. I'm gonna be here for the next 30 years. And under that kind of a decision, are there mitigations that people can do that would minimize the inconvenience of having, water in the basement? So looking at it from that perspective, it seems like over the past several years that we've seen that, yeah, there's some people that are interested in selling their home voluntarily. But we've kind of, taken the cream off of that situation, and I suspect that it's, a matter of opportunity over the next 20 or 30 years when people decide, yeah, it's time to move, that we have the opportunity to purchase those homes. I don't think, a large percentage of people are going to be wanting to sell their home until they're good and ready, unless there's a severe situation. And thinking about the $5-6 million over a longer period of time like that probably makes some sense in terms of, how we can anticipate purchasing. Connected to that, I think if we can be more definitive with people about what the situation is. We've got limited resources, and use those limited resources for purchasing homes. But, if you're not willing to step forward and say, yeah, I want to sell my home, that money may not be available for several years. And to be aware of that, if we've got real clear policy, or a clear plan as to how we're going to do this, then people know, they've got something fairly concrete that they can gauge against in terms of the decision they have to make. It makes a very hard decision a little bit easier.
Very good, sir. And I'll also add, I think we're scheduled to pay off this bond by 2027. Right?
The earliest you can pay it off is 7 years after. Yeah, 7 years after you got it, so 2027.
I'm gonna hold off. I'm kidding. Yes, sir.
Related to that, I wasn't here for the start of the program for Sunnybrook, but certainly here for the aftermath, and it'd be useful for us to maybe take a look at what worked, not work there. Or help them work on something similar, right? So,
Yeah. Exactly. Sir,
I have a question. So you were saying that there's a fair amount of just even the high priority homes that are based on estimates and not based on actual surveys. How confident are you on the estimates of these? I mean, if these were surveyed, how many of them would then fall into medium priority, or how many of the mediums would fall into high priority? Because we even really know what numbers we're dealing with at this point.
So Manager Armstrong, you hit the nail on the head, and maybe that's why we have brought up, I think some of them would fall off or move from high priority. Well, I don't remember the exact percentage for the high priority ones, which was a breakdown between, but there were a few that were still based on estimates. And so, the assumption was we used the best available LiDAR data at the time of the study. We used some, information on building footprints, and we said, what is the lowest elevation when you look at the LiDAR relative to the building footprint? It said that lowest elevation is the low opening. And then we made the assumption that, if it wasn't clearly a walkout, it had a traditional basement, and I think we said it's 8 feet below whatever we're saying is the low opening. It's possible we're feet off. It was the best information we had, but without response from the owners or getting actual survey. So there is uncertainty with those.
sir.
yeah, obviously, I think this is maybe stating the obvious. This is obviously, as Ed pointed out, a very, very big challenge for the district, so we want to attack the sources of uncertainty that we can, like go ahead and contact landowners to get the proper information when we're making estimates of the nature of the dwelling.
So what I'm hearing is this is essentially where we're going. And also, to make a point for the average homeowner, we don't want to be so intrusive. Hey, can we come in and just examine, how'd you like to invest in wetsuits? Because your basement is, So what we want to do is either this is a discussion or workshop, but certainly we're heading towards education. And what we believe are high priority properties, to find a way to bring that up to them. Say, hey, look, we've been looking at this and we're wondering, what do you think? Would you be interested? Just kind of be gentle about asking more questions to see if we could possibly help them. Some people, like what happened in Sunnybrook, would say, go pound sand, leave me alone. And they have that option.
Mr. President, one thing that seemed very successful at Sunnybrook Lake was President Lucas and I met with all of the people who would be identified as having homeowners.
Yeah.
And had one-on-one conversations with them. Some of those, and most of those we had survey information for, but wasn't an estimated elevation. We had one-on-one conversations with them to talk about, their relative interest in somebody purchasing their property, just seeing their home and hearing their stories about whether they flooded in the past or not, and knowing the layout of their house to know if they have a walkout or if it's a lookout or if it's a split and that kind of thing. So I think that's something else for the managers to consider, is if you're moving toward contacting the property owners that we just have estimated information for, and maybe offer to meet with them one-on-one to have a conversation.
So is there anything further that we can do to identify that? Because Manager Armstrong brought up a good point. How well do we know, he said, confidence, the danger that they're in, so to speak, for this sort of thing? And if we can identify that, or if we have that pretty well established, we can start the communication with them, have Bar Engineering contact them and see what they think about the matter.
I think if you go back a couple slides, Jen, it
Yeah.
shows, half of the properties, it's still estimated.
Okay,
And so, and we have, this is summarized for the sake of the conversation, but for every individual property, we
sure.
have the information summarized. So we would be ready to have a conversation with these homeowners and kind of talk through the results of the study, and maybe it is an offer of meeting with them in person. And maybe as part of that, if they don't immediately be able to say, yeah, come survey my house, maybe at the outcome of that, they're willing to say, yeah, come survey my house.
Okay. Yes, sir.
If I may, and I understand why there's not going to be infrastructure based on the study, but from a public relations standpoint, if I'm a homeowner, you got to explain to me why you're not doing emergency pumping, right? Or the city says, well, we want to do emergency pumping, or who has jurisdiction on emergency pumping? But you have to tell these people, guess what? There's no emergency pumping, right? So that has to be explained to people, to the taxpayers, that's not happening. Because they're going to ask that question, why wouldn't we pump it? Or the city of Lake Elmo says, why aren't you going to pump Legion Pond? And we're saying we're not going to. So I see a lot of interagency activity here, right? And certainly that's part of the job of the watershed, to work across communities. But I see that kind of PR thing of not, explaining that we're not doing that. So people understand that up front. So like, oh, so I could flood because there's not going to be emergency pumping, right? So
Okay,
that decision hasn't been made yet.
I know, but that is something that I would ask as a homeowner. I'd say, so you're not going to do any emergency pumping, or there's not any other solutions? because they're gonna ask those questions, I would ask those questions. And I'm not giving an opinion here, I'm just saying as a homeowner, what
Right,
would I,
yeah.
what would I think?
That's relevant.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to look at this in an actionable response to this data. Where do we start? You know, we're open to suggestions. I have some. We can turn this into a workshop, or we can direct you folks to contact certain individuals if that is the case. If you've got information in place and you can follow up on this, we can direct you to do that, and then possibly meet with people individually for something that we consider very serious. And we're taking advantage of this because of the recent trend with all the water we've had so far. Other areas have been hit, but so far in our watershed district, no complaints, right? Baylock's momentary time.
But I think after this week or last week, you think about 4 years ago when the water table was so high. Had we had these recent rainfall events,
Yeah.
we'd be flooding right now.
Mhm.
We're just coming off a couple of years of drought and lots of capacity, but if we were in a normal cycle, I'm pretty sure we'd be seeing some flooding out there.
Okay, so what do we do here? Start the ball rolling? Can we contact somebody? Do we put some words together and have us examine them, approve them? What do you suggest? I mean, I've got this idea. This is, and the other managers are certainly welcome to give whatever input on this issue. I think this is where we're at. Anybody?
I think a soft shoe initial letter to these folks, just to
There you go.
alert them to this, not don't say the bulldozers are coming or anything, but just kind of alert them to the status and give them the opportunity to request, or to meet with Bar or any of us, with you and just get the conversation started with all of them. That'd be my suggestion.
Sir.
I would suggest maybe we go high and medium on that.
Medium for paperwork, but high
The
contact.
medium risk,
Yeah.
dwellings, just because there's some uncertainty there and, some of them could be facing a significant
Right.
loss. And then also the other part would be to go ahead and, authorize Bar to move on to the next steps.
I noticed that, that all of the properties we're talking about are in city of city of, Lake Elmo. Really. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to work with the city a little closer because of that connection.
Yeah, they need to be aware. So it would be a good idea to contact them or to share this information. John, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to Secretary Bach's comments about
Yeah.
how it might feel to a property owner if somehow they find out that we're talking about their property to the city like Elmo. So
Then first.
I think what I'm hearing from the board is the first step would be to prepare a letter to send to the high and medium homeowners that we've identified and just making them aware of the status, but not necessarily even bringing up the word acquisition, but just making them aware that we've identified them as potentially at risk of flooding and like to meet with them to discuss the options.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a start. You need to, run that by us. Is it going to be a general letter of communication or?
As for that, we could draft it, bring it back to the full board, or if you'd like to us to draft it and send it out and give you a couple days to respond with comments, can do that. I know some of the managers will have very busy Julys and might not be able to.
Rough out there. I like the draft because then we can get some input. Yeah, and that buys us a little time. But it allows us to focus more on these issues. But yeah, the high and medium is a good idea. And then you can contact Lake Elmo, City of Lake Elmo afterwards.
Yeah.
Just in case.
Yeah.
Very good. Jen, awesome. We'll send you back the doors.
Just in response to the question about current water levels, Jeff did go around to many of the landlocked basins in the watershed, and I think in general, the takeaway is things look pretty good.
Things look good. The county was pumping at Rose Lake, as we're aware that the
Right.
Cimarron sewage treatment plant operator called the county and asked for emergency pumping. I think it was with 1 foot of the top of the berm. I thought it looked fine last week when I saw it. But everything else, I was out even tonight before here, I stopped at Cloverdale just to check that out. Everything looked good at Cloverdale. Where I did see high water was actually over by White Bear Lake and the Rice Creek, kind of the borderline of Rice Creek. Watershed and us in Matamidi.
Yeah.
All those wetland and ponds that go to White Bear Lake were extremely high. So everything over there was high. Sunnybrook, everything else was looking good. Neil Avenue storage is high. But that's part of our system. That was high. Other than that, everything looked good. Frederick's Pond, I checked that out, looked fine.
No fishing. Okay. All right, very good. So we have our marching order, so to speak. We're good to go. Jen, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Well, we're gonna follow this up, and John, let us know and possibly a workshop on this to follow that up. Another workshop. Our next item is the draft resource prioritization, 2025 Watershed Management Plan. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
If you recall, on May 14th, we met here and we talked about issue prioritization. At the end of that workshop, we talked a little bit about resource prioritization, specifically the lakes and streams, and ponds within the watershed. As part of the plan update, we're revisiting the water body prioritization because prioritizing water bodies helps you focus your management actions over the life of the plan, specifically monitoring and improvements to improve water quality within those water bodies. Just a recap of what was done in the 2015 plan. That's on the first page here of the memo. There were criteria that were used to classify 35 water bodies into 4 categories: high priority, medium priority, low priority, and then a 4th category of stormwater management ponds, which was really to separate basins that were used primarily for the purposes of stormwater, and it's useful to distinguish those between other sort of naturally functioning water bodies. In that case, the high priority water bodies were considered to be deep lakes, lakes that were impaired, lakes that had a significant declining trend in water quality, and also trout streams and outstanding resource value waters. Shallow lakes were typically medium priority if they had public access, and then low priority were just kind of the remainder. One issue with the 2015 plan classification is it did not classify all water bodies within the watershed. And it's somewhat arbitrary which water bodies received classifications versus those that did not. So one of the things that we've done this time around is to try and provide a little bit more universal objective criteria to try and narrow down the list of priority water bodies in the watershed. And I'm going to walk you through just the draft criteria that have been used thus far, what it means for some water bodies that might be elevated or lowered in the priority list, and then whether that's appropriate. And I have some recommendations there of things that we might change already. But at one point before we go forward is that the objective criteria are intended to be a starting point. It's helpful for you as managers to explain why you're taking certain action or why you might not be taking certain action. But as the managers, you have the discretion to change the priority of a water body. You don't have to strictly stick with the numbers. But if you deviate from those criteria, I think it's probably worthwhile to explain why, in the plan itself as part of the sub-watershed management plans. Based on the discussion at the 14th workshop, went with these draft criteria for separating priority basins. With respect to lakes, ponds, and wetlands, high priority are those that are classified as deep lakes by the PCA. That's very similar to the last plan. And also if they are greater than 50 acres in size and have public access. Medium priority received a threshold of 20 acres in size and having one of the following. It's classified as a shallow lake by the PCA. 20 acres in size and classified as a lake versus classified as a wetland. And we'll get into a few examples of that. And meets one or more of the following. It's either part of project 1007, it has public access, or it's listed as impaired. And then low priority is anything greater than 10 acres and not meeting a higher medium criteria. That threshold was used so that we could apply it to all of the public waters within the watershed, of which there are approximately 400. And to separate those that receive a classification versus those that don't. As I mentioned last time, there were some very small ponds, things like Fallstrom Pond, that were classified as low priority, but then other basins that were much larger that received no classification. So this was intended to be kind of a criteria for whether or not a water body receives a classification. And then very similar criteria for the streams. If it's a trout stream or outstanding resource value water, basically the St. Croix River, it's high priority. If it's upstream of one of those or impaired, it's listed as medium. And then low priority if it is a public watercourse. So basically it's not classified if it is not a public water. One of the major changes from this time versus last time is that the impairment is considered a medium priority criteria here versus a high priority criteria. And that goes back to our discussion at the last workshop. We talked about the balance between restoring impaired resources and protecting existing high quality resources. So right now, impairment does give a bump from low to medium, but it doesn't automatically put something as a high priority. John, if you want to jump ahead to the table 2. When those criteria are applied, this is the list of water bodies. The little superscripts at the end are intended to indicate what the previous classification was. So, for example, Acorn, parentheses, Mud Lake there, it's a high priority. It was previously classified as a medium priority. But because that 50-acre threshold has been used,
Right.
and it has public access, it's a big lake that people can access. It's a high priority. A couple of notes here, changes from last time. Acorn is elevated. Eagle Point Lake is elevated. Again, it's a large water body greater than 50 acres. It's in Lake Elmo Park Preserve. Lake Olson, greater than 50 acres, has access via Lake de Montrevel. Some that go down, Downs Lake and Goose Lake South are both impaired for nutrients. But because the impairment doesn't elevate them to a high priority, they're medium priority water bodies in this list. A couple of water bodies in medium priority that weren't previously classified, that's what's indicated by the NA there. H.J. Brown Pond, that's a large basin within Lake Elmo Park Preserve. It's also impaired for PFAS. And then that unnamed number 416, that's a pond it's a large pond between Eagle Point Lake and Lake Elmo. And so that meets the criteria of being greater than 20 acres and having public access, for example. Low priority several of the ponds that were medium priority were moved to a low priority based on the size classification. Things like Sunnybrook Lake, Getchell Pond, and Cloverdale Lake goes to a low priority. And then there's this last category here that I've called legacy ponds. Those are ponds that you have monitored in the past and maybe performed management actions for that don't meet these criteria. They're smaller than 10 acres in size and they don't have public access or part of Project 1007 or impaired. And we can talk about what you might do in this plan with those legacy ponds. One potential action is that if there are volunteers still available, you may consider to monitor them on a reduced frequency so that you don't, I mean, if you've been monitoring the water quality of these ponds in the past, and it may be worthwhile to continue to monitor them for the purposes of, identifying issues, not just in those individual ponds, but also getting kind of the broadest baseline possible. They could also be elevated to low priority simply on the basis that you have historically monitored them or they've been managed in the past. So there are just a couple of quick recommendations that were not clarified in the memo. One of the unknown or one of the previously unclassified and currently unnamed basins, that basin between Eagle Point Lake and Lake Elmo, number 416. That right there. I think you could make an argument that it may be classified more as a wetland versus a pond.
Shallow, it's very shallow.
Yep. And then the other one that may fall into that distinction is at the very upstream end of Raleigh Creek, and that's unknown basin, public water 394. It's by Oakdale. It's adjacent to an Oakdale development. I remember the name of here. Eastwood. That one may also be a wetland. And so I tried to use the classifications that were used in the previous plan as well as aerial photography. The PCA hasn't necessarily classified all these water bodies as shallow lakes versus wetlands. They kind of do that on a case-by-case basis. Where it was obvious that a basin greater than 10 acres or 20 acres was a wetland versus a pond in the sense that it probably didn't have standing water through a large portion of it. That was omitted from the classification. So
Something seasonal.
Yeah. So those basins, in particular, the one in Eastwood is classified as a low priority, may not actually be a pond, and then the one between Lake Elmo and Eagle Point Lake, again, may not actually be a pond. I would recommend that we reach out to PCA and see what their thoughts are on that.
I've got a question.
Sure.
If it's got a PWI number, isn't it either a lake or a wetland by definition?
It can be a lake or a wetland. Yep.
But it isn't a pond.
Sorry,
Is that PCA a difference in terms of how PCA?
probably shouldn't use the word pond at all. Public waters, the public waters, they call those, universally, they're referred to as basins.
Okay.
And so they're either referred to as a public water lake, they have a P designation, or I don't want to use P, or a public water wetland if they have a W designation. That's a DNR designation.
Yeah.
And it differs somewhat from the PCA designation. The PCA typically uses their designation to determine whether a water body can be listed as impaired or not. So if it's considered a lake by the PCA, they can list it as impaired. If it's considered a wetland, they won't list it as impaired. For example, there's some water bodies in Valley Branch that were previously listed as impaired for nutrients that have been delisted due to what they refer to as classification. So that was like, the PCA called it called it a lake, listed it as impaired, and then determined that it wasn't a lake, it was actually a wetland, and then delisted it. Like Bay Lake is like that, and Pringer Pond were both previously listed as impaired, and then it's determined that those aren't actually lakes.
So very quickly to alleviate some confusion on me, we're going with the MPCA designations and not DNR. Because my understanding is that DNR actually has many more.
The DNR, the purpose of going with the PCA designation,
Yeah.
yep, is to further limit the number of lakes that you would be classifying. So yeah, if you go with the DNR's designation, that's all of the public waters have a designation as either P or W. But the P designation for a lake by the DNR is actually pretty narrow. There's only, out of those 400 water bodies, only 11 of them in the watershed have a P designation. I actually have that in the table here, but
It's okay. I think we have our hands full, right?
part of the reason for these criteria was to get the number of managed lakes about and streams about the same as last time. So all of a sudden with your new plan, you're not looking at, oh, now we say we're going to monitor 70 lakes instead of 35. But I did try to apply the area criteria to try and separate out by a more objective criteria for why lakes would be monitored or action would be taken versus why they wouldn't. And that 10 acre is the threshold for PCA's impairment. So it seemed like an appropriate cutoff for the low priority versus the non-classified water bodies.
Okay. Gentlemen, do you have anything? What's our next step, Greg?
The next step would be to, well, ideally, you've taken a look at this list of water bodies, and if there are water bodies that you think are the wrong level, either they're too high or too low priority, you should talk about them and adjust them as needed. A couple of them that I think there's some. I think the biggest question is, should impairment be an automatic trigger for high priority? You know, in the past, you've taken actions to improve the water quality of impaired waters. You talked earlier tonight about moving forward with an alum treatment for Goose Lake. I think by having a water body listed as high priority, it does make it more competitive for grant applications. And so I think that's probably the criteria I feel the least confident in. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure.
Yeah, I was a little bit put off by just having impaired waters go right into medium priority. Seemed like we were designated impaired waters as the headed stepchildren of our water bodies, just as they're impaired, right? So, but maybe, and I think it could be a case by case basis, because there are some impairments we can possibly do a lot, really contribute to in towards unimpaired. And then conversely, there could be some that are so impaired that realistically we probably couldn't really move the needle on them, and maybe they could be medium to low priority. So it almost seems like the whole impairment thing should just be considered almost like on a case by case basis.
Yes.
Perhaps.
Rick,
When, you know, as I looked at the list, one of the lakes stuck out to me, and that's Rose Lake. And I think it may not kind of fit the classifications that you have here. Over the years, I've kept hearing about the treatment pond that's attached to it, and
Right.
the potential devastating kind of disaster that could come out of that. You know, we approached it when water levels were so high. And that by rating it higher, I think we've opened up the possibility of some kind of special funding to address the issue of that treatment part. I think ultimately that seems to me like, one of the best solutions possible would be to, get Cimarron onto the sewer system and eliminate that, um, septic system altogether. It would be a benefit for it would be kind of an equity issue. Sure. For people that live in Cimarron, a cost that is quite high for them and be able to address it, from that perspective, as well as from just a water quality perspective. And where would that water end up? That was one of the questions that came up. This is going to go downstream and impact a lot of water bodies and ultimately end up in the same crook. All of which is a problem. The part that I think also doesn't fit for Rose is that I'm not sure if additional monitoring, other than knowing where the water levels are and, what's going on with it, just in some general terms. I don't think water clarity or, what the concentration, maybe dissolved solids or whatever, is useful information to have. I'm not sure, but whether or not it automatically means that it needs to be monitored in the same way that other lakes are monitored. That may be a yes or a no, but to have it higher priority, and I'm not sure if that's medium or high, from what you're saying about high priority, making it much more likely that it would get, the funding needed to be able to address the issue. But I don't know if we need to necessarily have the expenses of doing the kind of monitoring we're doing on other wells.
It's almost a given that it's going to be paired because of its relationship to what's next to it. And those folks can't implement the change in the sewer system because of the expense. So
Yeah,
we're kind of stuck, so to speak. What do? We monitor, yep, it's still dirty, but
right. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily solve it, but at least if what we're doing is we're saying this is a priority because of these special circumstances. Then we put it in a position to be able to track some funding that would resolve the situation in the way it really needs to be resolved.
that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't know if we were able to attract funding for that. That's always extremely useful.
One question too would also just be where that water goes if there were to be an accident. I don't know that off the top of my head, but
Close to
horseshoe lake. So part of it would be like, what's the classification or risk to horseshoe lake? Because sometimes the action that you might take to address one resource will be to an upstream resource. It's like a particular storm, like the pond upstream of DeMontreville, for example, that pond 1. It doesn't have to be a high priority water body. If you find out that it's doing something negative to DeMontreville, then because DeMontreville is a high priority, you might do something in that pond. So similarly, like if Horseshoe Lake is a high priority and evidence shows, Rose Lake is a very high risk to Horseshoe Lake because if there's a dam fail, if the failure of the berm, then that would potentially be a reason to drive an action in Rose Lake. But I agree that because of those particular circumstances, it may be worthwhile to elevate Rose Lake. Again, that's sort of like, here's a specific reason of why, even though it doesn't meet these other criteria, we're going to treat it as a medium priority water body.
Yeah.
I guess in that same vein, and I was wondered this with Goose Lake, you have Goose Lake South and Goose Lake North. As far as I know, we suspect that they're actually one body connected and there's actually a culvert or something under that nobody can find. I don't know why they're two different things, because it looks like both Rose Lake and Goose Lake are divided just by 10th Street there. And for Rose Lake, it's all one water body, but for Goose Lake, it's south and north. Why wouldn't they just be the same lake?
Yeah, and it just has to do with the DNR's number distinction between them, classified as two separate water bodies. I would propose that water bodies that are part of a singular system
Mhm.
all receive the same classification based on the highest water. So like in this case, Goose Lake North would be considered whatever priority Goose Lake South is, and it would ultimately just be a Goose Lake. Similar with Rose Lake. I think there's a few other basins like that too. And just for ease of communication and management. I mean, it does get a little tricky in terms of like, where are you actually pulling a sample from? Are you sampling both basins? But I think that's more detailed than the planning level.
And then some history with Goose Lake North and Goose Lake South. The Pollution Control Agency listed Goose Lake South as impaired because they considered it a lake. But Goose Lake North, they originally had it listed tentatively as impaired, but then because of its size, it was determined to be a wetland and not a lake, so they did not list Goose Lake North as impaired. They only listed Goose Lake South as impaired, even though they're connected, and Goose Lake North has worse water quality actually than Goose Lake South.
So clearly the solution is to put a berm across Goose Lake South and turn it into multiple basins smaller than the impairment threshold.
And then they could just pump their sewage from there.
You might have to raise 10th Street. Okay. So, we need to, yes, go ahead.
Well, I guess I want to go back to the impairment thing because Vice President Ferrera, you said that having impairment as its own, potentially as its own separate classification or separate consideration. And I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, I don't know that I stated that. What I thought was that we should look at our impaired waters individually and then decide what their priority should be, rather than automatically put them all in medium. So if there's one that has an impairment, but it's really in our domain to do something about it, we think we can do something about it, then that's just, to me, that should be high priority. We have an impaired water body, and this organization right there could potentially make a major contribution to get it off the impaired list. Conversely, there could be one that's so impaired that it's like, well, you know what? At the bullet, for example, if it's impaired from PFAS, that's not something that we're gonna be able to attack, obviously. So,
Sure, and I should clarify that the consideration of impairment in this draft here is if it excludes the impairments for mercury, PFAS, and PCBs.
I did see
with
that,
with the assumption that you're right, that
we don't.
probably
we don't work
beyond
on
the
that
scope
realm,
of
yeah.
this organization.
I just see that, and I think that was wise to do
So along those lines, do you have kind of a, based on the other considerations, the impaired waters include, McDonald, the ones that are classified as medium priority right now are the nutrient impairments for Goose Lake, McDonald Lake, and Downs Lake. Goose Lake also has the criteria of being adjacent to a park. I think there's actually a fishing pier on it, versus McDonald and Downs, which are both entirely surrounded by private land. Goose Lake was classified as a high priority in the 2015 plan. Would you leave it as a high priority?
I'd like to hear from the other managers, but perhaps. I mean, it's impaired for nutrients.
Yep.
And do we have the capacity to do something about it?
I think Goose Lake.
Yeah.
Yeah, Goose Lake, yeah,
We're doing-
that's on that was just approved tonight, so.
Of course,
You're talking about McDonald Lake?
No, I was thinking of the lake over, just west of Lake Elmo, I just couldn't.
So Downs Lake is heavily polluted, so that in order to, you're doing a study right now to determine how you might be able to improve it. It's likely that the cost estimate to implement the BMPs and lake treatment are going to be very, very large, not much. So that, I guess, that is maybe an example of where it might be almost impossible to remove that water body from
Right.
the water system.
And whether we put that as low or medium, if they list something as a high priority and the public looks at it, they're gonna say, well, that means you're gonna do something about it, right? And if there's a lake that sadly we have to triage, because we really, the cost of delisting is just way beyond anything that we could shoulder, then we would put it as low priority and be prepared to explain why we put it as low priority.
Or to explain it, yeah, easily.
What if we say that if it has a public access and it's impaired, then we'll call it considered a high priority? I mean, that would only really capture Goose Lake, but I mean, then you've got two measurable criteria. So I mean, suppose if somebody
Yes.
put a dock on McDonald Lake and had public access, then it would be automatically, but if you have just those two criteria.
It's also big enough, McDonald's holds, fauna, right? Aquatic fauna. Fish.
Yes.
This McDonald or along
They,
the west side of the.
they aerated, no.
McDonald
Yeah,
is-
Silverdale.
Cloverdale Lake.
And McDonald is kind of right on the borderline, so that one you probably can get delisted if you implement practices.
Very interesting. So,
All right, good. Thank you for the clarification, though. That helps it helps me understand how the impairment would be considered in there.
right, thank you, yeah.
And then I had a few specific
Do
questions.
you want,
Is now the time to talk about other specific water bodies?
Yeah, it'd be great.
Because I'm just concerned about Kells Creek. No. For some reason, I finally have it straight on my feeble brain now, but for some reason, I always thought that Kells was cold water, and it's not, right? Are the upper reaches of Kells cold water? Do we know?
It is perennial flowing, so therefore you think there's groundwater flow to it,
Right.
so the groundwater is cold. But the DNR is not classified as cold.
So if somebody asks us, we move Kells from high down to medium, what's our answer?
The high priority streams are given high priority due to their classification as a trout stream or an outstanding resource value water. The DNR has put this, basically the state has put a higher value on those resources through those classifications. And Kells Creek was a high priority in the last plan, and again, it's impaired for bacteria. But the water, the district has cooperated with Acton on projects to address that impairment. And I think there's progress being made. You could consider elevating that to a high priority again, based on the ability to do something about that impairment.
yeah, I
That's
think
the
we should.
principle.
I'm a little worried about the message it sends if we're trying to
Yeah.
work with the city and we look at all this stuff, the bacterial experiment there.
No, we should,
significant.
yeah. That's gonna be ongoing.
Another point with Kells Creek is that it is also listed as impaired for TSS. And it drains directly to St. Clair River, which is listed as impaired for phosphorus. So if you do something in Kells Creek I think you get multiple benefits because you can deal with the TSS and creek itself, and you can deal with the reduction of phosphorus to the St. Clair.
Yeah, that's a win-win. Also a health issue. Right?
And lastly, just what do you want to do with those legacy ponds? Want to cut bait or keep monitoring?
Well, I like the notion of joining the Goose Lake North.
Yeah.
Goose Lake South.
Yep.
So that takes care of one.
Yeah, we're doing the Allen in both basins, right?
So we can just monitor them infrequently or on a longer rotation period.
That's one option. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a simple option because we should do it anyway. Not that every year, every couple of years, it could be 3 years, 4 years, whatever. But we keep track of it. So it's part of our inventory. Okay. So consider that.
Where's Fallstrom?
Also, this in Hampton.
Downstream of the Amazon warehouse.
Is off Neil.
My obsession of all.
East of Neil Avenue.
So it's a cluster of 3 ponds. There's actually a deep depression, so the Amazon is right here, and then
Yep.
there's a big depression in this area, and Folsom Pond is, that depression would have to fill up and spill over and underneath the Folsom Pond. So the other ones on this list, Beetle Pond is this pond at the curve in Stillwater Boulevard. Project 1007 flows in and out of Beetle Pond, and Beetle Pond then discharges into Raleigh Creek and into the Point Lake. Mergen's Pond is this pond in West Lakeland Township. At high water conditions, it'd be 1 pond, but low water conditions, it's 3. Legion Pond, we've been talking a lot about, is this pond right here, just to the east of Lake Elmo. And then Cloudwater Pond is this pond up at Keats Avenue and just south of Highway 36.
This is a total distraction, but Cloudwater has a special place in my heart. Because we used it in '84 to do one of our first wildlife booking mortality studies. All right, end of that.
Keep it up, right?
This map also does a good job of illustrating the light green streamlines there are, they are within your district maintained stream database. They're not classified as public waters. And again, the way the classification system works is that, you know, because Eagle Point Lake, for example, is a high priority lake, you can still do an improvement with the Farney Creek, that's right. If Farney Creek is eroding and providing sediment or nutrients into Eagle Point Lake, you identify that that's a source. Still, you can still say, oh, Eagle Point Lake is a high priority resource. It's being negatively impacted by this stream. We're going to do an improvement in this stream. That's still a high priority action because it's within the watershed tributary to that stream. So
Right.
even without classifying all of these stream reaches, you still have a good defensibility or argument for why you would make improvements to those streams.
That's very good. Okay.
So again, this is part of the plan development, so you don't necessarily need a formal action. What we're hearing tonight is that generally, most of these criteria are okay. But to make some recommendations individually for the impairments. And then we talked specifically about Kells, Goose Lake North, combine the basins that are kind of artificially separated into single distinctions. And then we'll move forward with that priority for the purposes of developing the plan. I'll probably provide a revised classification in the near future as an informational item. But again, because the plan isn't being sent out for approval or comment anything yet, all of this is still fluid. But I think I have enough to move forward with.
Very good.
And then we'll look at Rose Lake.
Yeah.
Right. The north side too, right, which looks better. Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you, Greg.
Good stuff.
Appreciate your help. A lot of stuff there. A lot of stuff to go with it, so I'm going. We'll talk to you soon, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Update to Tri-Lakes flood control brochure. We had something on this previously, right?
Well, Mr. President, managers, since the last meeting, I've received a lot of phone calls from residents around the Tri-Lakes and Lake Elmo, especially Lake Olson, Lake DeMontville, concerned about high water levels. The water level of those lakes is near the DNR's ordinary high water level. And the concern is that since 2020, the city of Lake Elmo lifted, no wake ordinance for high
Right.
water levels. So there is no restriction. People can create a wake. And the Tri-Lakes brochure that the Watershed District put together several years ago that was in your packet. That's put together because high water levels at that time, people were very concerned and didn't know exactly what the Watershed District's role was in regards to high water levels. And so the brochure attempted to define the various jurisdictions. So it talks about Valley Branch Watershed District and so the flooding and only able to manipulate the water outlet control structure of the Tri-Lakes between February 15th and April 15th, if the water content of the snowpack is greater than 4 inches. At that time, there were residents wanting Valley Branch to lower the stop logs and allow the lake to be lowered just so that the water levels would not reach the city's wake elevation. So there's a lot of education going on. If you lower the Tri-Lakes, well, that water's gonna go someplace. It's gonna go to Lake Elmo. Lake Elmo's gonna come up and you could maybe a different example might be if somebody tried to lower the water level of Silver Lake, well, then the Tri-Lakes is gonna go up. So it's just understanding the hydrology there. So that was the goal of the brochure. But after these phone calls, the brochure was still on the website and it included this information that's outdated, talking about the city's no wake elevation. So I pulled it off the website, and I guess the request tonight is if the managers feel that it's useful information and if we should update it. They want to go ahead and update it just because this has been a very political issue.
We do need to update this, and based on the conversations we've had recently with some of the residents, we need to include in my opinion, a friendly reminder about the consequences of wakes. And that's not stepping on anybody's toes or doing anything wrong, but certainly update this, but it does look good. You know, we need to get this information out, especially the residents on the lake. You know how far out these go. But that's important, and that satisfies some of the residents, because one gentleman that I spoke to claimed that the DNR told him we can't do anything, the Elmo told him we can't do it. So everybody was not blaming everybody, but sending him to different.
It is really up to the city of Lake Elmo if they
Yeah.
want no high water level.
Yeah, and that's okay. What we're saying, by providing this information updated, that these are the consequences of that, and I don't know how much information, a paragraph, if that's possible to introduce the concept, say, these are the consequences of high wakes, you know, destruction of habitat, littoral zones, blah, blah, blah.
If
Sounds
that's
okay.
tenor of the board, we can definitely draft something and bring it back to the board managers for final review.
We just direct you to do that. Then please do that. Very good, sir. Okay.
By the way, this was on PC's website,
We provided that to,
on the PFAS page.
Oh, yeah.
they were told to give credit to Valley
They
Branch.
did actually, yeah, they said this was provided by Bill.
Okay. Our next item. Attorney. Counselor, what do you have for us? What were you doing?
I was looking at the packet on my left side of my computer. Sorry, I'm ready. So there is a memorandum in your packet. It's not in the packet, sorry, it's in
That's why it's not on the side, because I didn't get anything.
the memorandum isn't in there either. Your memorandum, sorry, I'm looking at what I've received online.
Tell us what's going on while we're going through that.
If you're thinking about the landlocked or the easement, that's under managers, not under.
Oh, that is what I
Yeah.
was thinking, that's where I was going, sorry, I got nothing.
It's okay.
I was jumping right to managers.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
I have
Yeah,
nothing.
and that's based on our recent conversation with that.
Yeah, sorry, I was all prepared to talk about it, so I'll talk
That's
about it
okay.
a little bit.
Okay, Counselor, you're off the hook,
All right.
but we will require your services shortly. Inspector, Mr. Brower.
President Marshall, manager, there was a report in the packet. Couple of quick updates to that. Didn't mention earlier when we were talking about all the basins. Silver Lake outlet was at 12 inches over the weir this week, so it's gone up 2 inches each week the past 3 weeks. It's flowing fine, no issues there. I did see Raleigh Creek flowing within its banks into the Lake Hamilton Reserve, no issues there. I did look at Cloudwater as well. There's no issues at Cloudwater. So if you have any other questions from the report, other than attending some erosion issues from the rain, I've had some construction sites that are battling issues with erosion that they're
So-
working with.
Once again, what's happening with the dealership? Any latest word?
They have a punch list of things to perform, and contractor and developer haven't implemented them yet. They're aware of them. The city has issued them a punch list. I was out there this week and talked to the contractor as well. They've got some erosion issues they need to deal with out there.
Okay,
And the same at the Black Diamond. I think the last meeting, they had a big blowout from the rain on a slope, and they've been
oh yeah,
working on correcting that. They've worked on addressing the upstream issues of that erosion. And so I think they've got that addressed, but now they're trying to restabilize this big slope. And with the rain, it's been slow going, so, but they're on top of it. Other than that, just normal stuff like that.
beautiful. Thank you, sir. Do any of the managers have anything? Problem? Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate your help. Okay. So now, under managers, we're going to address this particular issue, the easements and floodplain that was brought up by Mr. Brock. And when that is concluded, depending on what happens there, we can revisit the Kine property 2024-001. Excuse me. Yeah, never mind, but we've identified it. So let's move into that. And Mr. Brock, I'm going to ask you to lead us into this and tell us what your impetus was for trying to establish what we're looking to do.
I'll ask yourself and John to correct me if I misstep along the way. Don't hesitate to correct me. First off, I want to frame this. Our rules say that we will get easements on DMPs, so that the future maintenance of those is ensured. That's not in question. What we are specifically talking about is the floodplain easements up to the 100-year flood level. Whenever we have a permit on a property, we require that the permittee identify that boundary with the surveyor and then grant us an easement over that, and they record that also at the courthouse. And there are certain instances identified in the rules as examples, but there's other things where we might want to consider that, and we have waived that requirement a couple of times in the past month or two. And so after the last time, I asked for further discussion on this to help clarify. Again, I have this bad habit. I try to put myself in landowners' shoes on some of these issues.
No, that's good.
And for instance, I've got a low corner in the back of my property. I don't know if it's in 100-year, but it might be. Just say, for instance, it is. And I I did some work rehabbing my house a few years ago and I disturbed some land, but it was determined it was small enough. I didn't need a permit. But if I had, if I'd disturbed a little more and needed to do that, I would have complied with all that, but I would also have the privilege to hire a surveyor, goes back to my property and provide a legal survey, and I would have to pay the surveyor. And then I would have to pay, somebody like our esteemed attorney to take that to the courthouse and record it all at my expense for the benefit of Valley Branch, so you would hold this permit forever on my property. And it just didn't
Right.
seem right. And so it seemed like maybe we ought to take a look at that as where are those limits and how would those policies apply? And without getting into it's getting late, so I don't want to get into a lot of the discussion we had. But bottom line, we felt, or at least our discussion, was that certain instances, like developments and that sort of thing, we are definitely stick to that, no question, we'll do that. Other instances, some that came to mind were lot splits. I think where it wasn't a development, they were just changing a property line. And resource protection project where somebody's voluntarily doing something for resource protection and say it triggered a permit. Are we going to require them to do all this and punish them for doing the right thing? That was an instance, and there you go, right there.
You got the second two bullets. So it's first bullet, if there's
Right.
basically a fill in the floodplain.
Right.
activity.
And
So
those are the-
like
those
a
are the-
retaining wall.
Right. Our discussion at our meeting was that those are instances where we would be comfortable not requiring that floodplain easement. And then the other one was where it's that situation I explained, well, and it's this permit right here that we pulled earlier tonight. That landowner's going to be required to do what I just explained to comply with our permit. And so for individual landowners, what we talked about is maybe, still go ahead and get the easement, but how about if Valley Branch and those private landowners, if Valley Branch paid for the survey and the easement report and not burden the individual landowner with that cost? Maybe that would, that seemed to be a little more fair. So that was our discussion in a nutshell. But the BMP for easements, that all stays, no question.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Explain the very first one, fill in the floodplain. I mean,
This was so the recent examples of that where the managers waived the need for easement was some lakeshore work at Lake Elmo and lakeshore work at Lake Jane, where they did some fill. The net fill might have been zero, but they did some fill where they removed some old wooden timbers as a retaining wall and replaced it with boulders. So there might have been either a net zero or a net amount of fill. So that's
but I think the next.
or a sand blanket.
I mean, floodplain is important, the floodplain, right? It's storage, there's a lot of things that are of floodplain, so the way that's written, it almost sounds like if somebody was just going to dump a bunch of fill in the floodplain,
that's the way the rules are written, is that it's fill in the floodplain. We don't care if it's a sand blanket, beach blanket, or boulders, or totally reshaping the bank. We call that fill. So, and that triggers the need for it.
because if they're gonna do a major change below the OHW, DNR is gonna have something to say about it as well, so, yeah.
But this is saying if there's those kind of permits, an easement would not be required over the 100-year flood.
That seems reasonable.
It does, it's just that the way it's written right there, it doesn't specify
Right.
that for certain activities in the floodplain below it, that we would not require a permit.
Okay, so one concern that was born out of this, and I believe it was brought up by our attorney, was to avoid the arbitrary nature of triggering this or not. In other words, why would we let somebody get away with it, so to speak, and others not? So we have to put in language that prevents that or keeps our policy consistent. Correct?
Correct.
Counsel.
You don't want it to be arbitrary or subjective, right? I like this project. These are good people. Let's waive it. I mean, it just doesn't,
Yeah.
you know, that doesn't work. There needs to be some a little more criteria with the decision to waive. And so what I just wanted to point out is, by the way, this is what I thought I was talking about when I was like, what do you mean there's nothing in the packet? Even though John drafted the memo, I was all planning to talk about it. But John helpfully provided the original rules or close to the original rules from the watershed, and then also the current rules. And if you look at its Rule 5, number 3, A, at the very end, it just says, you know, the floodplain, blah, blah, blah. So there must be, managers may waive this requirement. So the point that I wanted to get across is that number 3A says that there must be dedication and or perpetual easement to Valley Branch. And then it continues on what that easement needs to encompass, which is essentially up to the 100-year flood elevation. And then it also says the managers, in some situations, the managers may waive the requirements. So I just want to clarify, it was a little confusing when you were talking about the permit application earlier in this meeting. This discussion is not about changing your rule, because that's a big process, right? That's multiple months long. The discussion is saying, if the managers want to waive this requirement on a more frequent basis, I am more comfortable if you do that with some criteria set under what circumstances you would waive that criteria versus, I think we should do it. That sounds good. Let's do it. Right? I just think there needs to be more basis behind it.
Fair enough.
So things on limits of how much.
Yep. And so that's really kind of what the discussion that we had last Monday was, you know, thinking through it and what is the purpose of this easement? Because don't forget, there's also going to be, so what Valley Branch requires is a stormwater maintenance agreement. And that's typically recorded right away. And we use the full legal description for the property. And my nutshell description of what that says is anywhere that there's a stormwater management facility on this property needs to have this kind of maintenance. And that's important because future property owners need to know that in fact there is a stormwater maintenance facility on their property and it needs to be maintained, right, in perpetuity. The second document that Valley Branch requires, and this is, it's not totally unique. There are some other watersheds that require it, but not many in Minnesota, is an easement up to the 100-year flood elevation and over any stormwater management facilities. So that's where the sticky wicket comes in, because that's typically done at the end of the permit. Because that's when everything's actually been installed. That's when people know where it is. And that's where I get a lot of pushback from homeowners because they've already paid their surveyor. Now they got to pay the surveyor a second time to come up with a legal description for that easement, because the easement isn't going to be over the whole property. It's got to be tailored. Right.
But that example of where you get pushback, we're not even talking about that tonight because that is really over the rainwater garden, over the water quality feature, not over the floodplain issue typically.
Yeah. So then, John, to follow through with what you're saying, they're still gonna have to pay. So I'm still gonna have to have that argument with
Yes.
people.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what we're talking about is the scenario where there's a rainwater garden, and as Manager Brock mentioned, someone that's not even close to where the stormwater management facility occurred, there's property that's under the 100-year flood elevation. So in
For
that,
example, the permit that's tabled tonight, they're creating more than 6,000 square feet, the rules require lawn control. They'll need to do a rainwater garden or something equivalent. They'll need to get drainage easements defined by a surveyor and have those easements recorded. But there's also a natural system through the property that the 100-year flood elevation may change and go up. And the discussion tonight is if it changes and goes up and it's no longer within the drainage easement that already is defined, that Valley Branch would pay for the surveyor to redefine that 100-year flood elevation over the natural feature.
so, sorry, I'm gonna keep fleshing this out. So Valley Branch would not pay for the easement over the stormwater features that are part of the permit, just the extra space for the extra land. Okay.
And one more thing, historically, to let the managers know that, because I inquired about this, that has not been a problem with cost or a high cost. So because of course, I bring that up, like, well, this is all gonna cost us now.
It's typically, what I am told
Yeah.
is it's about $2,000 for the easement after the fact.
Right. And how often do we do it? And I know that that's not the priority. It's not about, as you pointed out, it's not about the money, but it's certainly a consideration to look at.
Yeah, that's the pushback I get
Yeah.
from most property owners. It's not that they have to do the easement, it's that they have to now pay another $2,500 or $2,000.
Well, and previous board had that discussion and the previous board used to waive the surety for individual projects. But then there's no stick, so people would never build their rainwater garden that they're required to do and get the drainage easement over that. So the manager stopped waiving that surety and said it's $5,000 minimum in case Valley Branch would have to go out there and do the survey.
Okay. So. We could give this further consideration. Managers can mull over this. Or we could establish the criterion for what we're gonna do here. And we're not kicking the can down the road, we're just evaluating this and seeing. It seems like the right thing to do because we're helping the individual. But maybe we don't have enough information or the managers aren't ready to commit, sir.
President Marchand, I guess, if we're springing this on everybody.
Yep.
What I'd suggest is that we presented it, we put it on a future agenda as far as making any decisions or taking any action.
Right.
And this particular permit tonight, I mean, there are stormwater practices on it right there, John.
Yeah.
They haven't defined it
Yeah,
yet, but
there will be. And so, they can get that surveyed at the same time. It's might not be a huge extra cost to them on that one. So,
Incremental.
right, so.
Yeah.
I mean, if everybody's okay with that, that approach, I would make a motion to discuss that in the future and also to approve permit 2024-28 as it stands.
I will second that motion. It's been moved and seconded.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
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 Do the managers want me to put any proposed resolutions together based on the 3 criteria that were outlined or the 4 criteria for review? Or do you want to have more discussion before I spend time drafting a resolution?
My gut feeling is to have a little more discussion on the matter, although we'd hate to give you more work. You
It's
get it.
okay, I just don't, if you're, because we had talked about me drafting it and I didn't get to it, but if the managers wanted that for the next meeting, I want to make sure you have it. But if you want to talk about it before anything's put on paper, that's fine with me too.
Yeah. How does that appeal to you?
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
John,
Yeah, that's not, this doesn't.
but it's not going away.
Mhm.
We're definitely gonna do something. Figure out what we're gonna do, but certainly you are gonna have to chime in without a doubt, so. We're okay, but thank you. Right, any further thing on that? Nope. Okay. Manager, floodplains. Did anybody attend the Lake Elmo Village Vision Study Open House? And would they like to talk about it? Okay, no crickets either. That's what. Not that it was bad. St. Croix River Workshop on the Water. Except for Mr. Brock, all the managers attended, so it might be redundant to bring it up. It was an interesting ride. I snuck an extra sandwich because they left that stuff out. But, you know, not to be, yeah. What are you gonna do? It's rough out there.
Very high
All
water
that
level.
choppy water, very high. They brought up a couple of good points that everybody's more or less aware of. I'm explaining this to you about what would happen if somebody came to the river's edge and decided to build, and how would that affect what rules and regs and all of the other things, erosion, all the environmental concerns. And did they provide us with enough information to do that? And again, I want to encourage, I assume everybody else does, that they make these things or continue to make them informative. But I also want to add that these aren't meant for third graders or people that are completely ignorant on the subject, that more material needs to be covered, and that very nice ranger, very good person, but I never got goosebumps, he said he was getting goosebumps and addressing us and everything. And I go, who are you talking to? And he goes, oh, I'm used to talking to kids. Okay, well, tell us more, and that's kind of what I'm looking at. I'm not really criticizing this. I'd like to see more meat in these discussions or these explanations or lectures that they provide for us. Because we're a little ahead of the game. We're part of the team that's involved with this. So there's a lot of things that we know. So that's what it was. And the sandwiches were okay.
John and I did have a discussion based on that variance exercise that we
Yes, sir.
did on the boat. Thinking it would be a good idea when we're faced with a request for a variance, that we have a worksheet similar to that we can just go through and justify either why or why not we would grant a variance.
Good
Just something
point.
we can look at.
I enjoyed that exercise as well, and that was in a setting where it's well in scenic river variances, so it's probably even more intense than what we deal with.
Oh, yeah.
Those situations, but,
It was.
yeah, I think Bill's suggestion is a good one, actually.
And maybe actually, Susanna, I don't know if you could develop something like that, but it would make
Yeah.
sense maybe to
I
have.
mean, if I actually have a memo that I prepared just saying, here's the outlines, but to convert that to a worksheet could be pretty relatively easy.
That's excellent. Yes, yeah. And we have more meat on that. Excellent. So something good did come out of it. And the summer tour, does anybody have anything on that? Don?
Rick and I were both there. I
Okay.
can let Rick fire first, or I can go first.
Rick, tell us about the
I also
chloride.
have some information to augment the evolving chloride landscape that came from, well, you heard the legislative summary, so on Tuesday afternoon. So go ahead, Rick.
Yeah. Well, I guess to start with that, it sounds like it's not so much, the discussion at the legislature is kind of a discussion between the trial attorneys and the applicators. And, they've got some issues between them. The applicators want full liability coverage and protection. And the trial attorneys are looking at it differently. Apparently, there's been some recent movement in terms of the attorneys saying, well, okay, we can compromise a little bit on this. Obviously, it didn't make through this past legislature, but seems, it seems to kind of struggle on. But it's not clear what happens when the House could change significantly. In terms of the session itself on fluoride, okay, so basically what they were doing is doing a test to see whether or not they could reasonably expect to draw chloride out of a lake at a high concentration chloride. It was impaired, and do that at a economic cost. And what really came out of it is no, both in terms of the amount of cost, it was somewhere around $11 a pound of chloride. And they had, I think they had 354,000 pounds of chloride coming in a year.
Statewide,
No, this is Parker's Lake in Bassett Creek, WMO.
354,000 pounds.
Yeah, I believe that's correct, what I got there. They managed to get 16% of the chloride out. They need 36% to be able to
Delist it.
to
Yeah,
delist
to get it
it, to
delisted.
reach a reasonable level. All of that, what that all really says is this approach isn't something that works, and that the primary solution is probably to go back to the source and control the chloride at the source. And so I think that gives us some direction in terms of our upcoming workshop, in terms of looking at how do we approach it here. One of the key things that we may want to look at is possibility of identifying which sources are most likely to be contaminating our district, and can we work with those organizations to see if we can reduce the chloride that is getting into the system. Whether it's how you remove it or how you treat it there or whatever it is.
Yeah, my thought on that, Rick, is that, I think you captured the Parker's Lake study fairly well, but perhaps in some systems that don't have that much coming in, it could work, right? So it's not universally bad. Some systems. Yes. I think it'd be.
It certainly was one test,
Yeah.
one experiment.
They gave an example of possibly doing that at some stormwater ponds at Ridgedale that then drain into Parker's Lake. So that we could possibly do it on stormwater pond other than.
Yeah.
And, and that may be part of what the solution is.
Yeah, and Sean Kennedy is the manager on Bassett Creek WMO, and he is also, like myself, a new member on the Minnesota Watershed Board. We had our board meeting this morning, and then I was talking to him about that, and I told him that we're putting a workshop together for later in the month. And he mentioned something briefly about they're finding out that I thought he mentioned sweeping in conjunction with Medicine Lake appears to be really working. I don't know. I know that we're doing targeted sweeping for leaf litter and stuff like that, but I don't know what, what he was referring to. But he said that, if we want to, he said that Laura Jess has been handling the outreach stuff for this. So then, of course, Barr had working on that specific project. But he said Laura has been speaking here and there about it as well. So she would be another possible invite to our workshop.
And sweeping would make sense. And I think there's been some studies on the cost return of doing that. Woodbury, that's through the smart salting course that's,
Okay,
you go out and you pick up the remaining salt in between storms, so.
so before it gets washed away, there's still residual salt on the road after the snow event, and that can be stuffed out.
Is it,
And the other,
Yeah.
one other thing that kind of came to realization of is that, you know, this is really very seasonal for the most part. You know, if you don't think about, softeners, water softeners, you know, it's pretty much road salt type of stuff. And so that's seasonal, you know, if you're able to capture that early in the spring, you know, maybe that's a lot of the issues. There may be some ways to kind of narrow it down to a reasonable kind of a expectation.
that's a concern. I just want to add, is, Oakdale and Woodbury doing something about that now? The sweeping? No?
I would need to ask, I don't.
We can, I think if we have Kyle join us from South Washington, they've actually helped fund some of the smart salt and trucks. Or
Yes.
Mhm.
is it Woodbury and again Cottage Grove, Melissa?
In Cottage Grove.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
Kyle,
those are applications.
Yeah.
Force.
Another example, Ramsey, Washington, paid for heated steps or heated sidewalk or a city
Sure.
area.
Those
So
co-
just to reduce the amount of chloride that you have.
Sure. And there's gotta be a nice benefit there. And sit on the steps in winter.
In your shorts.
Yeah. As long as the temperature's high. You know me. Gentlemen, thank you very much. What do
Maybe
you
just
say?
augment real quick. So I
Yes, sir.
don't know if anybody gets the Minnesota Watershed's newsletter, but they just had one come out end of legislature and right at the top,
Mhm.
in the environment finance bill, they have a description of what happened. Rick, what just Rick alluded to. I mean, part of the problem was the immediate past executive director didn't think that salt was a big problem, and he was basically not correct on that. And so, and they've been working on this for a few sessions, and some of the negativity was, well, policymakers are getting tired of hearing about it, they're getting weary. So it was really refreshing. The new lobbying firm that was hired to replace Ray, they're absolute rock stars. They really are. I mean, we've done an absolute 180 about face on our capacity. They came in with the same contract that Ray's on.
Oh,
They just have a team of people as they divide the work.
nice.
And they're really good. They gave a great report and they got the door cracked open on this. We didn't get a bill passed, but there's dialogue that's happening. And
That's
and
important.
the sides that were averse towards each other now are starting to think about possibly working towards a compromise. So, yeah.
Okay,
And Minnesota Watershed in general is doing so much better now. We've got districts that are coming back. In fact, we've outgrown Arrowwood. And
Really?
This December, we're going to Grandview Lodge up on Gull Lake.
really,
Yeah.
I've never been there.
That was my very first governor's fishing opener. Aside from the fact that I didn't ever catch anything on the governor's over, it's a beautiful lodge. It'll work really well.
How much further is that? Or
It's,
Probably close.
it's just up 371 of base.
Yeah.
But Baxter,
Hmm. Sounds appealing. Okay. Very good.
and then the tour yesterday was pretty spectacular.
Uh-oh, what
Some
happened?
of just some of the things we saw were just amazing. This Highland Bridge project where the Ford motor plant used to be.
Yep.
It's just staggering what they're doing there.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's just,
Yeah, it's a nice combination of so many uses, you know, both in terms of aesthetics and walking
And
and
housing.
hiking and emergency services and water storage.
Really?
Yeah,
That's good to hear.
we should do a couple of those. They were only, what were they?
just 12 night.
12,
Yeah.
A couple of them.
Stop buying houses if we have the money.
Make everybody pay. Okay. Very good, gentlemen. So we've got that covered. We have another item here. Let's see, we have, resolution 2024-03. Melissa, thank you very much for your services. And I would just say, in my tenure as a manager, being introduced, you've straightened me out a couple of times. I sincerely appreciate that. You've been instrumental, always patient, always good with us. And I do sincerely appreciate that. So I'm gonna, don't fall asleep. I'm gonna read this resolution out loud, and I want everybody to know, and I'm sure the other managers do, what you've done for your communities, for your service for the Watershed District and for the state. And this is important. And this is the kind of service that us individuals provide for government. These are the things that we do that make it worthwhile. So government isn't just something that's imposing and sitting on your shoulders. It's something that is part of how we live, how we make our communities better. So with that said, resolution 2024-03, a resolution of appreciation to Melissa Imsa for her 15 years of service to the Valley Branch Watershed District. Whereas on October 22, 2009, Melissa Imsa brought her cheerful outlook and ability to summarize meetings in concise minutes to the Valley Branch Watershed District. And whereas some motions by managers could be paragraph long, and Melissa Imsa was always able to capture the entire motion. Thank goodness. And whereas. Yeah, there's more. Thank you, we captured that. Whereas in 2018, Melissa Imsa became the Valley Branch Watershed District website administrator after helping the managers design, organize, and populate the current website. And whereas Melissa Imsa kept the Valley Branch Watershed District website up to date for 6 years. And whereas Melissa Imsa assisted in preparing 15 Valley Branch Watershed District annual reports. And whereas Melissa Imsa has attended approximately 295 Valley Branch Watershed District board meetings, always quietly taking notes and occasionally advising the managers. You're good. And whereas Melissa Imsa has been instrumental in advancing the Valley Branch Watershed District's mission of protecting both the water resources of the district and helping our community. And whereas, sorry. Melissa Imsa has performed her duties in a wonderful, gentle, and professional nature. I apologize. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Valley Branch Watershed District Board and managers and consultants wish to express our heartfelt gratitude and sincere appreciation for Melissa Imsa's 15 years of outstanding service to the Valley Branch Watershed District and wish her and her family health and happiness. Here's a token of our appreciation. Sorry about that. Didn't want to sound like a sissy.
Thank you very much. This is very unexpected. I really appreciate it, and I've really enjoyed my time on the board. Been through a lot of managers, and I can say that I think the 5 of you obviously represent the watershed. So you guys have been doing a lot of good work. I was proud to be a part of it. So thank you very much.
Okay. Excuse me, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. What's that?
You
We need
need a
Pat's
motion and a second. You read it, but you need a motion and a
I'll
second.
make a motion to approve this. Do I have a second? It's been seconded by all the managers.
Aye.
I,
Aye.
Hi.
It is approved. Thank you, Ms. Melissa. Okay. Just a couple more items. Our meeting in Baytown, July 11th and 25th. Will we be attending?
I will miss the 25th.
What? Okay. We'll have a quorum.
I'll miss both. I'll be 7 hours ahead. Maybe I'll connect in if they haven't saw me yet.
If you can send, you can attend a meeting while on safari, that would be awesome, in the middle of something.
It'll be 2 in the afternoon and 2 in the morning, so I don't know if they're doing any spotlighting when hunting nowhere.
Okay.
Especially if you're like being chased by a thief.
Right, yeah, I won't have time to call in if that's the scenario.
I hope you got some good insurance. Okay. And also our 2025 budget workshop, August 20th, 5 to 7 PM. Let's not forget, I assume everybody will be there. And our chloride management workshop, Baytown Community Center, August 27th, 5 through 7 PM. Sir,
And there's also a Baytown Township
on Monday,
meeting on Monday here, and staff from the Pollution Control Agency and the Minnesota Department of Health will be here to talk about PFAS that's been discovered at a well.
I plan on attending it, as you mentioned, if there's a quorum that we need to post it, so do any of the other managers? Okay. Okay.
I might, because of the nature of the problem, if I'm free, I might. And
Okay.
could we just post it? Just
Yeah,
to
just
say-
post it. I
Just
need
post
to,
it,
I
yeah.
forgot to bring the workshop
Good.
posting anyway, so I'll be back to post those.
Okay.
August 20th.
Miss Melissa, I bid you adieu, but consider us for any future stuff we could ask you. You know, of course, we'll pay you, but don't lose sight of us, please. With that said, motion to adjourn.
Second.
Been moved and seconded.
Aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.